Good evening, everybody. I think we'll get underway. There's still people piling in, but we do need to get underway. I'm Rose Fenton, and a huge welcome to Free Word and to this evening's event, Illiberal Democracy, the Future of Freedom. And also a big welcome to our distinguished panelists, who I'm going to be introducing in a moment. But before that, I just wanted to say a few words about Free Word and the context for this evening. For those of you who know us, as you know, we're an international centre for literature, literacy and free expression. And we work with our residents, with our founder members and associates to develop programmes and projects that explore and celebrate the power of words to change lives. And this evening, it's part of Free Word's Unravelling Europe programme, which is a series of discussions of films and exhibitions led by artists, and that's very important, led by artists that explore the political and cultural complexities at play within Europe today. And a Europe where, as we know, democratic values, including human rights and free expression, are increasingly under threat, and that's without mentioning Brexit. So, you know, we are in I think, a serious turning point in our history in Europe at the moment. And that's what this series is seeking to address and asking, why is this so? And what are the consequences? We're delighted to be working with Index on Censorship, one of Free Word's founding members, on this evening. And before we get underway, I'd like to invite David Heinemann from Index just to say a few words about the work of Index on Censorship. David.
Hi, I'm not going to keep you very long at all. Just besides to say that Index on Censorship, we were founded in 1972, and we're very proud to be one of the founder members of Free Word, which is a little bit younger. But one of the things that we've done since then is publish a magazine quarterly, which exists as a sort of platform for censored voices and to promote and celebrate the importance of free expression. And this is the last edition here, which has a sort of focus on the way in which Shakespeare and Shakespeare's work has been used to protest and provoke and slip by censors internationally. And I guess it's quite a nice way to segue into this evening, and what we really wanted to work with Free Word specifically to focus on Poland and Hungary and Turkey as three quite different countries, but who all right now appear on our radar far too often. And we wanted to invite some artists and figures from the world of culture in the broader sense to kind of reflect on where we're coming from and where we're perhaps going to when we think about freedom of expression and freedom more broadly. And yes, I suppose we're all going to want to know in some small way what they think about Brexit. But that's just a sort of fun bit. Index is delighted to be here. We've got some magazines outside. Please do take a look and enjoy. And I hope this evening is a real joy. It's an absolute pleasure and privilege to be here.
Thank you, David. And that's the great thing about Free Word, is that we always collaborate with all our founder members and associates. And my job is to make it all add up to more than the sum of its parts, which is a wonderful thing, tricky at times, but actually absolutely brilliant to be working with Index on this. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our panelists, or in fact, conversationalists, as this evening is conceived as a three-way conversation. I'll explain a little bit more later. But first of all, Agnes Heller was born in 1929 and is one of the leading thinkers to come out of the tradition of critical theory, covering ethics, philosophical anthropology, political philosophy, and a theory of modernity and its culture. Hungarian by birth, she was one of the best-known dissident Marxists in Central Europe in the 60s and 70s. Agnes has held visiting lectureships all over the world, including the Hannah Arendt Professor of Philosophy at the New School in New York. She now lives in Budapest and is one of the most popular and outspoken critics of the current regime. Agnes, welcome. Thank you. And moving on now to Adam Zagajewski. Adam, who's just stepped off the plane from Poland. So great that you're here, you got here in time. Adam is an award-winning poet, novelist, translator, and essayist. He's currently professor of the University of Chicago's Department of Slavic Languages and Literature. Born in Lviv in 1945, he first became well known as one of the leading poets of the generation of '68, or the Polish New Wave. His poems and essays have been translated into many languages. In 2010, Adam was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature, and last week he was awarded the prestigious Griffin Trust Lifetime Award for Excellence in Poetry. Adam, welcome. And lastly, Elif Shafak. Elif is an award-winning novelist and the most widely read woman writer in Turkey. Critics have named her as one of the most distinctive voices in contemporary Turkish and world literature. Her many books have been published in more than 40 countries. She writes fiction in both Turkish and English, and her work draws on diverse cultures and literary traditions, as well as on her deep interest in history, philosophy, Sufism, oral culture, and cultural politics. Elif lives between London and Istanbul. And she's also on the board of Free Word, which is wonderful. And she's going to take the role this evening, not of chair, but of lead conversationalist in a three-way conversation. So let's see how it happens, how it unrolls. But really just to say that the starting point for this evening is Orbán's proud assertion that Hungary would strive to be an illiberal democracy or state, citing Russia and Turkey as examples. And this was immediately picked up by Kaczynski in Poland, who said that Poland would follow suit. So we thought we would start by asking each one of our three conversationalists, what exactly does this concept of illiberal democracy mean? What does it mean to each of you, and how does it apply in each of your countries? And we will be starting with Elif, who will then get the ball rolling and pass the baton round. So once again, welcome. It's wonderful that you're here.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Rose. I've been very much looking forward to this conversation for a number of reasons. I'm very happy, excited to be under the roof of Free Word, to collaborate with Index on Censorship, but also to be in such amazing company. Agnes, I pronounce your name in the Turkish way, with the Turkish pronunciation. To be next to such a critical mind, such a leading philosopher, and a polymath like Adam is a great pleasure for me to be next to you. And I find the subject very important, and I think this is going to be one of the crucial debates, one of the crucial themes of the next decades. And it is, my feeling is, it's going to become more and more important and widespread. We will see other countries, unfortunately, following this lead. I want to start with Turkey, not because it's my motherland, but because I think Turkey almost gives us a template, that some other countries have copied in this journey. But before I do that, allow me to remind you one of the data that was published by Freedom House recently, actually. They have drawn attention to the fact that when you look at the countries all over the world, more than 60% of them today are electoral democracies, which means they have some form of elections, some form of ballot box, and people can vote, people can express their choices. And this at the first glance seems like a huge or an important progress, because in late 1980s, this number was only 40%. So back then, we had 40% of the world's countries electoral democracies. Now it's more than 60%. It seems like the world has made progress. But did we really make progress? Are these electoral democracies really democracies? Are they liberal democracies? Are they pluralistic democracies? And coming from Turkey, I hesitate to say yes. I think many of them are illiberal democracies, or they have tendencies in that direction. Now, in Turkey, we had a very clear journey towards illiberal democracy. It started about 13 years ago when the AKP came to power with lots of hopes and lots of optimism, which I also personally shared. Many liberal intellectuals shared that hope. It seemed like a progressive step forward. It was much more pro-EU, pro-reform, and also Turkey, interestingly, maybe in that regard it's slightly different. It's a country that has gone through 3 different military takeovers, coup d'etat, each one worse than the one before, with human rights violations every 10 years. So it seemed like the civilian rule that was pro-reform, pro-democracy, pro-EU was really going to open up the country and launch it forward. Over the years, this journey went through different seasons, and I think its connection to democracy became very sour, particularly after 2005 and 2006, when the relationship with the EU was cut off. I'm not saying this is the only reason, but I want to emphasize this. Once the EU or European nations were thought to push Turkey away from Europe, what happened in Turkey was it directly played into the hands of isolationists, particularly nationalists, ultranationalists, and Islamists. Of course, I'm aware that the Turkish government also failed to fulfill the EU criteria, but both these factors contributed very badly, and from then onwards we are going down the road, down the hill, in a very fast way. It's so fast that there's almost no time to contemplate. Every day something new happens. I just want to add one more thought, hoping that we will see some similarities, or we'll also talk about the differences. More and more I hear this kind of talk when I go to Turkey. People are saying, well, maybe the Western model is their model. It doesn't suit us. It is not in our nature. It's not part of our history, part of our culture. Maybe we need other models. And so this is becoming more popular in Turkey at the moment. People talk about Singapore, how we can have economic progress, financial achievements without democracy. They're saying democracy is a waste of time because you're just losing time. And what we need is a strong leader who's going to defend our rights, operating, working closely with a group of technocrats and bureaucrats who have absolute allegiance to the leader, and this will launch the country forward. So what we have, in other words, in Turkey is, in my opinion, definitely not democracy. We have majoritarianism, which makes it much more difficult to talk about the situation because we have the ballot box, we have the vote, and we have a party that came to power again and again and again, increasing their votes at every election time, but a party and the leader that do not adhere to the rule of law or separation of powers. What do we do with this system? Does it sound similar? Agnes, can I start with you? Do you see similarities?
I think that the term illiberal democracy was basically invented by the Hungarian Prime Minister. And he also defined what illiberal democracy means. He spoke about the central force field. That is, everything needs to be centralized. A center should decide upon everything, political, economic issues, and that the center is one single person who is the center of the center, who will decide upon everything. How can this be a democracy? You already spoke about this issue. Democracy and liberalism were developing separately. The first democracy, was in Athens. And this democracy was democracy because the majority decided. The majority decided that Socrates should be killed. And Socrates was killed because of his free speech. Yeah? Because he spoke up his own ideas. He spoke up against the deities of the city. Every opposition speaks against the deities of the city. Since then, he was executed. That was democracy without liberalism. Liberalism is a modern development. Basically, it was discovered here in England. England was the first which discovered liberalism. Political liberalism is basically division of powers. It is all the liberties granted to the citizens, the freedom of speech, etc., all the liberties granted, and that no one should wield the power for a longer time and should be always controlled by other kind of powers. That is, no central force field. And no central force field. That is the importance of liberal ideas. Now, liberalism and democracy became united in the 20th century. Where and how, it remains to be seen. I will talk about it briefly. But liberal democracy means that there is a majority decision, but not majority rule. Because if majority could rule, that would be, as Americans say it, totalitarian democracy. And that is liberal rights of minorities, of individuals, checks and balances, divisions of powers. Extremely important that power should not be centralized, no central force field. So Orban was right when he spoke about central force field as the idea of illiberal democracy. But I think that is what we believe to be a state of liberty is the state where law rules. And in the state where law rules, all the liberties, political liberties of the citizens are not just granted, but also practiced. And this is what I think it's important to keep in mind. The first time I said this, it was before the United Nations. It was a kind of meeting by the United Nations. And when I said it, a delegate from Africa stood up and said, how right you are, because we have free elections. The majority is always won by the majority tribe, and the minority tribe will be so oppressed by the majority tribe because they won the elections in majority. You don't need tribes for this. You can manipulate majority to the effect that the majority should be always on your side, and the minority will not have rights. There will be no counter institutions. This can be settled. This was settled in this way in Hungary. I give you a very little example. At the last elections, 44% of the population voted for the ruling party. 44% of election victory meant for, in Hungary, 2/3 of parliamentary seats. In Germany, the same meant that the German prime minister had to make an alliance with the Social Democratic Party. Angela Merkel could not rule alone with 44% of the votes, and for the same 44%, the Hungarian party got the absolute majority. This is the electoral rule. It's very important what kind of electoral rule you have. Electoral rule should also be not just democratic, but also allowing the liberal values and virtues to be realized, actualized in the given country. So I think this is the Hungarian case. I rest my case now because I have other questions to ask.
Absolutely.
And we'll have now Poland.
Thank you. We'll now have Poland. Yes, indeed.
Good evening. I'm not a political person, but I'm not going to read my poems tonight. We are very new in this. It's 7 months, and it's a very radical change. Of course, our Mr. Kaczynski, who is this eminence grise, he is imitating Mr. Orban completely. What's strange in Poland is that the political elite, the people who are now either in the government or in the opposition, are friends from the Solidarność movement. So these are old pals. They knew each other for ages. And suddenly there's this explosion of, there's this very deep division and explosion of hatred between the two camps. For me, the notion of illiberal democracy is as an oxymoron. I don't think that it's possible to have, well, it is possible because we have it, right? But we have a problem with naming this system that's new, that's, as I said, 7 months old. Some time ago, I wrote a little article for the Gazeta Wyborcza, which is this leading opposition newspaper run by Adam Michnik, an ex-dissident, and now dissident again, in a way. And I wrote this article under the title, "Ladies and Gentlemen, Fascism is Not Very Far." And many friends told me, "You're crazy, it's not fascism. We don't know what it is, but it's not fascism." But it smells like fascism. Right? It has the smell of fascism. Although technically speaking, there are still oppositional parties. As you may know from the newspapers, the main contention, the main bone of contention is our Supreme Court, which we call the Constitutional Tribunal, because the government tries to paralyze it, and to say exactly as Agnes said, that the majority has everything. It's like in poker. You win, you get everything. Right? But election is not a poker. Luckily, we have a very strong mobilization of the civil society. We have huge demonstrations against this government. It seems that almost the entire intelligentsia, or I think 90% of people who are active intellectually, are against this system. So it means I'm not totally pessimistic, although the instruments of power are in their hands. Because of this mobilization, because of the spirit of resistance, I think it won't be easy for the government to completely thwart the opposition.
I think I'm more pessimistic than you, because just to give you an example, recently there was research published by Pew Research Center, and they asked the people in different countries a very simple question: do you think, in your opinion, is it okay for the people to criticize their government loudly and publicly? So this question was asked to people in various countries, but it was mostly Muslim countries around the world. And I'm looking at the list. In Lebanon, the percentage is quite high. Above 90% of the people say, yes, it's okay for the people to criticize their government. And then when you go to Jordan, it drops down around 60%. In Pakistan, it drops to 56%. And I'm looking at the list, where is Turkey? Because in the past, we used to be close to Lebanon in such researches. And Turkey was at the bottom of the list, and it was only 52% of the people saying it is okay for a people to criticize their government publicly, openly, loudly. Now, to me, that 52% is very interesting, because we are a very divided society, almost half and half. And it shows that almost half of the society thinks it's not okay to criticize your government. The moment you do that, you are labeled as a traitor, as a betrayer. And that's a huge, huge problem. And this is one of the things I was hoping to talk with you about, the role of the past, because it seems like in these illiberal democracies, whether we call them illiberal democracies or not, but the past is not bygone. The past is revived through a very nationalistic lens, and it's being used again and again, both the dreams of the past, like we have these neo-Ottoman dreams that are almost shaping our foreign policy. But definitely, I think, in the Middle East, in Turkey, the past is very much part of the conversation today. Does this sound familiar?
It sounds familiar, but it is different. Because, of course, the question in Hungary is not whether you have the right or whether it's good to criticize the government, whether you have the means to criticize the government. It's not a question. No one will say that you have no right to criticize the government, but the government takes away all the money from the opposition newspapers. They cannot survive. How to criticize the government if all the radio stations, all the television stations are in the hands of the government? Of course, a few people have access to in internet you can criticize the government. Also, there's still 1.5 radio station where you can criticize the government, and a half television station when you can criticize the government. But these stations will never reach 90% of the population, because the station can be accessible only in Budapest and a few big cities, not in the countryside, not in the villages. Those people get only government propaganda. That is, the question is not that I repeat whether you can criticize, whether it reaches the people, this criticism. It does not reach the people. People need never confronted it, the criticism. The same people, according to opinion polls, 60% is dissatisfied with the situation in Hungary. But they cannot express why are they dissatisfied, because you need to have a language for it. At least not, I do not mean Hungarian language, but a political language, a language in which you can express your dissatisfaction. If this political language is not available, then you are just drinking together with your friends in the pub and curse. Yeah, that you can do. But that is, you mean cursing the government is criticizing the government, but it has no effect.
Which brings us to freedom of speech, of course. I mean, is it a similar pattern in Poland?
Well, yes and no. The biggest newspaper, the opinion newspaper, is the opposition newspaper, and it's doing actually much better now. So that's a good news, because people read newspapers more than before. There are many people irritated by the new government, and our previous government was a little boring, so no one wanted to read newspapers. But it was a liberal government, so they didn't. The new government is an ideological government. They want us they want to make out of us national Catholics. They're very, precise program what we should think about history, about God, etc. But no, we still have very strong possibilities of expressing free opinion. Although media, the so-called government media, had been totally controlled by the new government, and suddenly there's a huge drop in the, how do you call it, not visible, but in the watchability of the regime TV news lost like 40% of viewers. So I don't want to sound like someone who is totally enthusiastic. No, it's very difficult, but we still have, we are not silent. I mean, the critical side is not silence, but as I said, it's only 7 months, so it's in the making. We'll see how does it progress.
Yeah, we have a longer experience in that
I
regard.
don't envy you.
No, don't envy us. It's not an enviable position. And I think every writer, journalist, academic, poet in Turkey today, and cartoonist as well, we know that because of something you say in an interview, an article you've written, a book you've written, a poem you've written, something you say, in a speech, you could be put on trial, you could be sued, but also lynched on social media, demonized on mainstream media, and it could happen just like that, in one night, 1 week. Everything is so slippery. I think everybody has that knowledge at the back of their minds. I personally wouldn't believe anyone coming from Turkey who would say, I can write whatever I want, I'm totally free. I don't think it's like that at all. And as a result, there's also another subject we find a little bit difficult to talk about, which is self-censorship. Not only about political taboos, but also sometimes sexual taboos. We do apply different degrees of self-censorship, which brings me to my next question to you. As artists, as academics, because we have our own world, and we like to produce in those sometimes bubbles, sometimes cocoons, but there are moments when we feel the need to get out of that world and start talking about politics, which is another world altogether, in my opinion. Its dynamism, its rules are very different. Do you feel that tension between the academic world, the thinking world, with its nuances, and then the need to say something about politics. And when, I know you've been very vocal, you've been very, very open in your criticism, but were there turning points in your life? I'm curious. Was there a point when you felt the need?
No, I don't speak first about turning points of my life, I'm about the turning points of my country first. Sure. Hungary had a great tradition of poets who were so-called the messiah of Hungary. That is, poets were really most important figures in Hungarian cultural life. The greatest poet of the 19th century, Hungarian poet, wrote freedom and love. These are the most important for me. For freedom, I sacrifice my life. What he did, in fact, he did sacrifice his life for freedom. But it he wrote in poetry. The poets were very important. Now this is less the case. Now novelists are more important. But for whom? Poets were important for the whole nation. I think poetry was read in every village. Today, the poets are read by writers, or perhaps by 10% of school children. They are not read by the population of the country. That is, the writers are still in the opposition, but these writers are maybe writers of the elite. There is an elite. There are certain school teachers who always read modern literature. They are being fed on this food, but it does not reach the population at all. So in this way, the contemporary culture is less effective now as it used to be also in the Horthy period or in the Kádár period, because people are not, I would say apathy, a kind of apathy, no interest in this kind of intellectual work. So writers, basically they do their best to write and speak for the opposition. About academics, okay, that's not the case, because most academics are very dependent from their salary from the state. Every academic is dependent on the state. They are afraid for their jobs. They are afraid whether they get a better position in the university. And a lot of academics are naturally, because we are humans, they are cowards. This happens. I don't mean it critically, but this is the fact. This is factum brutum, that people are afraid. They have family, they don't want to lose their jobs. It's important for them. Nowadays, teachers, high school teachers, started to revolt. That's the newest thing in Hungary. High school teacher, that's a civil society of high school teachers, started the revolt. They are revolting, but the government promised everything for them. No one single promise was kept. I don't know what's going to happen in September. They will not stop their revolt, the school teachers. I tell you why, because the whole school system became centralized. All students have to learn, for example, history from the one single history book, which will be distributed by the state and written by the authors of the state. That is indoctrination, especially nationalist indoctrination. Now you may say that nation, of course, Hungary is a pagan country, unlike Turkey and unlike Poland. So in Hungary, the only God is nation, and the only religion is nationalism. This nationalist core, then the people will react on it. Even intellectuals will react, even academics will react on it, even some teachers will react on it, because that's so dear on the heart of the people, which is poor, which has nothing, which is a small nation, which has lost 2 world wars. And after this, and survived this communist time afterwards. And the only proud they have is that they are members of a wonderful nation. And that's the only thing they can be proud about. We are Hungarians. Oh, our soccer team now plays in I don't know, World Cup. So that's the great thing. That's a great nation is the great thing. So because of nationalism and the tradition of the nationalists, the writers, the most of the writers are not nationalists. Most of the writers criticize this ideology, but their voice does not reach, I would say, the broader layers of Hungarian society.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Adam, in relation to this, there's a question I've been looking forward to asking you about Czesław Milosz. His essays left a big impact on me in my own journey, and I found lots of similarities. But I couldn't help but notice, I mean, a mind like him, such a brilliant mind, writing in 1950s, 60s, he predicted that nationalism was going to disappear, religion was going to become meaningless, because we were all making progress as humanity. Do you think, and I know you write about the role of intellectuals, sometimes even the helplessness of intellectuals.
He was a very interesting case, intellectually speaking. He was a Christian, a believer, a real, not mystical, but he tried to be orthodox. He was not, I mean, not orthodox in the Russian sense, but he was, in politics, he was a liberal. So for me, he's a wonderful model. You can, because usually you say, oh, he's such a religious person, he must be on the right wing. But he creates, he's not the only one, but it's a minority of people who are religious and yet are leftists or liberals. And he was afraid of Polish nationalism. And he actually predicted that one day these hidden or not so hidden tradition of this so-called national democracy in Poland will take over. And this is what happens today, not as I'm still officially an optimist, so I'm not saying that it's for a very long time. But his prediction, his fear was that there is this, because this national democracy in Poland, they never had power, and between the wars, they were in the opposition, bitter and more bitter, and under communism, there was no possibility to express these kind of opinions. And now they take their revenge. Now, speaking of literature, you're right. You know, we are living in a time of late postmodernism, so it's not a good weapon against political regime, right? Late postmodernism is about everything, but not about taking a moral stance. So it's a problem.
I feel a pressure or a need or an almost urgent need to write more politically, to speak more. I know you said I'm not a political person, but do you feel that dilemma? Because I do. That's why I'm asking, probably.
Well, yes and no. When I was young, I was young once, and I was very political. I was a political poet. In the 70s, I belonged to a group with our friends. We wrote against the communist government, not in a total sort of reckless way, because we were not crazy, but we were very critical, and we paid for this with years of silence, with not publishing. Later in the 80s, I can speak for myself. I thought politics was done because communism was still there, but was ideologically dead. They had no arguments. It was just an empty shell. So I turned to a different kind of writing, more oriented towards, I don't know, philosophical reflection and love and death, and the main subjects of poetry from 4,000 years. And now, in the last 7 months, I feel I have to do something, But I just wrote one kind of sardonic, satirical poem against this stupid new government. And I don't see myself as now, producing entire collections of poems directed against our ministers, or we have very good journalists. There's a lot of this critical work is done by journalists who are courageous and who so far have a total liberty to speak. So I don't think that literature we'll see. But so far, there are not many writers there are many writers who sign all kinds of critical letters and manifesto against this government, but very few who express themselves in their books, in their poems or novels.
Sure. I guess sometimes through silences, but also sometimes through internalization of those values. Maybe we contribute, knowingly or unknowingly, to this continuation of the status quo. And what I mean by that, again, inspired by Miloš, one of the things that stayed with me was how he talks about normal people, good-hearted people, kind people, internalized, and smart people, intelligent people, internalized totalitarian values without being aware of it. When do you do that? When you think you're surrounded by enemies, when you think, something unjust is going on and you have to defend, that patriotism, the pressure of patriotism. I don't know if these things resonate
I want
with
to
you.
go back to what Adam was saying previously. And I said that writers, poets, or philosophers are in opposition. I do not mean that in our philosophical work or in our novels or in our poetry will make political statements. It means that those people who are good at one thing have certain kind of authority. And with using this kind of authority, they can write in newspapers. Yeah? They can write essays, they can write, I would say, analysis of the political situation, journalism, a kind of journalism. This is how they can contribute to the present discourse. It means that they contribute to the present discourse as citizens, among all the other citizens, not as privileged people. They have no privilege. Their only privilege is that their name or their works are perhaps known by many, known more than other citizens' work, who is a doctor or a painter or whatever. Maybe we don't know them, but writers are normally known because there are a lot of book fairs in Hungary, books are always presented, and if a writer says something, it means more than when anyone else says it, although he says it as a citizen and not as a writer. As a writer who is not in his writing developing opposition positions, because he writes whatever he wants to write. And this is a freedom of the writer, yeah? Not to be politically involved in his writing or in his painting or in his philosophy, but doing it as a citizen. I think it's a very important distinction.
I like what you're saying, but maybe in Turkey we experience something different, because yes, on the one hand, novelists are like public figures, not novelists, but even though we have a very solid tradition of poetry, amazingly rich tradition, but what happens is, because we do not as a culture give an autonomy to writers or poets, the moment you say, any one of your characters says anything critical in a novel, that is attributed to you, and you are labeled, pigeonholed in a box, and that becomes the category. So people don't make those distinctions. The writer as a citizen, the work is different, the nonfiction is different, everything is lumped together. I don't know if this sounds familiar. We lost nuances. There aren't nuances anymore. And it's a question that matters to me, but maybe we will carry on with the audience's questions if there are any more people who are interested in this.
I read one of your books, you wrote about it. It's not a work of political propaganda. I think that the books, the novels, are not works of political propaganda, any propaganda, even good propaganda. But the person who wrote this book can, in his journalism, make, in a way, a kind of political propaganda against a government who oppresses people, free speech, and everything that is dear to the heart of people who appreciate freedom. So you write about this, but you don't need to write it in a poem. That's different from ancient times, because the ancient Hungarian poets wrote this in poems. They were revolutionary poems. Now this is no more the case. I would hardly say that the poets write revolutionary poems, but they can speak up for freedom in their journalism, in their essayism, in their interviews, because they give interviews, constant interviews. They can speak up for their ideas, for freedom in their interviews.
Maybe it's because I come from a feminist movement, and one of the things that I learned from women's movement was that politics is everywhere, you know? It's also in the private space, it's also in our bedrooms, in our kitchens. When you write about sexuality, that's also very political in Turkey. So, because politics is so dominant and so divisive, does it resonate? I mean, these nuances with the Polish experience.
When you're a writer or a poet, you defend two things. You defend the political freedom, but you also, I think in our moment, in our historical moment, you have to defend the imagination, the magic of the imagination. And you cannot allow, I like what you say, but I don't quite agree that everything is political. It would mean the death of the imagination, which is disinterested and which has to do with which is this sphere different from politics, and we cannot allow, because one of the losses that we can, we can lose this freedom of imagination, becoming too political, giving everything to politics. We need also, because I personally believe that we have souls. It's a very old-fashioned view, but I think that we have souls, and we have to defend. Democratic freedom, and we have to defend the soul. There's no contradiction, but there are two different spheres to some extent.
No, absolutely. I can relate to that. And I'm not saying that everything is political. I'm saying politics is everywhere, even in the private space. So it's not only in the parliament or within political parties. But one final question perhaps we could dwell upon and then open the floor for questions. I know we're going to have maybe some Twitter questions as well. Do you think there should be any limits to freedom of speech? Because this is, I think it's a vital question, also in the UK, also at universities. I don't know if you've seen these new research done with university students, in which many university students are saying, we don't want to hear opinions that we're not in favor of. Basically, that's what they're saying. So vetoing speakers. What is your approach to that question?
I think that we should make a division between public, private, and intimate sphere. And that a different kind of norm applies to public, private, and intimate sphere. On the public sphere, I think you should express every opinion, judgment you do have. That is your right and your obligation. And maybe others will tell you that it is dangerous, it is wrong, also freely. That is, the public sphere is about public discussion where everyone can express, of course, has a kind of judgment upon my own view. I judge my own position, whether it's good enough to appear on public with it. But in the public, there is no restriction. On the private scene, it's different. The private, for example, within an institution, you are in a university, you are in a school. I give you a very, very simple example. According to my view, grading at the universities is simple stupidity. You should not grade students at all. But I still grade my students, because as long as I'm the university teacher, this is my obligation that I grade my students. In publicly, I say it is stupid, but in the private life in university, I do grade my students. In the public sphere, I can tell about a writer how bad is his writing. But if a friend of mine comes with his poetry and asks my opinion, I do not want to hurt him. I do not want to humiliate him. I will say, okay, I don't know, who knows, perhaps, etc., something like this. And certainly that I'm not obliged to give my opinion, because giving my full opinion freely, my opinion, would basically, in a way, humiliate the other person. I don't want to do that. So I think that the modern distinction between public, private, and intimate sphere is an important distinction also from this point of view.
What do you think, Adam?
Well, you asked about the freedom of speech.
Yeah, are there limits to it? Are they
Yes, absolutely.
Also, maybe we should talk about hate speech. You know, do you think it should be prevented? It should be monitored or controlled?
Well, I think we have to learn from history, and I cannot understand radical nationalism today. They're idiots. They don't know about fascism. They don't know about the dangers of nationalism. How can you be a radical nationalist today? But returning to your question, it's a very dangerous moment. There's this very handsome politician in the US, Mr. Donald Trump, who is just abolishing the political correctness. And the political correctness is partly stupid and partly necessary because it corresponds to kind of decency. He's abolishing this decency. And I'm afraid he is followed in every continent, right? This beautiful hair, this voice, this passion, and people, I think he's influencing in a very bad way. He's really abolishing the rest of decency. Now you can say everything. You can say the Jews are, he's not saying it. The Jews are stupid.
But he's free to do that.
Yeah.
That's his freedom of expression.
Right, right.
Yeah?
Well, in Poland, we see beginnings. For a long time, any kind of public anti-Semitism was taboo. Now you see some small, shy beginnings of it. Sure. And I think that's really a very dangerous moment because free speech needs limits. We have to defend these limits.
Where do you draw the limits? Where do you draw the boundaries?
Well, the hate speech, the racism, anti-Semitism. I'm not only a politician. I'm not a politician, and I'm not a lawyer. I don't know how to do it, but I am in favor of having fences against hate speech, against hatred in public sphere.
I agree with this, but the fences should be fences, moral fences, not legal fences. But that is a kind of moral consensus that this is the limit, people should not transgress this limit. But it is not through legislation and prohibition, in my mind.
I think, again, the Turkish case can be quite an interesting case study because we come from a very strong state tradition, a bit like Russia. And we started with illiberal democracies, coming back to the way in which they work. I believe in a liberal democracy, pluralistic democracy. You protect the individual from the excessive power of the state. In Turkey, we have it upside down. It's a topsy-turvy world. You protect the state from the words of the individuals or from minorities. And the state is already robust. The state is already all-powerful, but we still treat it as if it were made of glass, and it could be broken any moment, so we have to protect it. So where do I draw the limits? For me, it's a very key value, freedom of speech. I'm very critical when universities, of university students, but also faculty who say, no, these speakers should not be allowed, they should be allowed. We need to hear multiple voices, and we need to respond to books by writing alternative books, to speeches by giving better speeches, not by banning them, by vetoing them. But I have one criteria where maybe about that I'm more sensitive. When it is hate speech that provokes violence against minorities, sexual minorities, cultural minorities, because people who are already vulnerable and alone in a society, not the state that's already robust, but minorities and individuals, if there's violence and trigger of violence, I think we need to be careful about that. That's my personal approach. But would you like to join us with your questions, comments, your critical remarks, please?
Hello. I'm actually a Turkish novelist, like you, but less popular, sadly. I had written a novel in 2007, which was quite an erotic novel that got me into trouble, particularly with the Turkish press. And I'm currently actually working on my second novel, which is sort of a criticism of the government, especially of how they dealt with Gezi protests. It's about a protester.
Sure.
But I'm not going to ask you about that. My question is more about the Kurdish minority in Turkey and what you think. As you probably are following, recently the parliament voted to lift the immunity of MPs, which was mostly to do with the Kurdish party, which is the only sort of legal and democratic voice which should be, I can't find the word, but it should be held upwards and sort of rather than suppressed. And I think, of course, if these MPs are imprisoned soon, which people suspect they might be, it will cause a serious problem in terms of democracy and the voice of such an important minority in Turkey. And I just want your views on that.
Thanks so much. Thank you. I mean, very briefly, I think it will be a catastrophe. It is already incredibly alarming when the MP's immunity have been abolished. In a normal democracy, it wouldn't be so alarming. But in a place like Turkey, where the judiciary is not independent, we have seen that it's not independent, and everybody knows that this mostly targets Kurdish MPs, and tomorrow they could be arrested. I really think that would be a very, very dangerous thing. I'm very worried, to be honest, because in June elections we have seen, for the first time, a Kurdish or region-based party becoming a national party. And they came forward with very liberal values about minorities, about women's rights, gay rights, which was exactly what Turkey needed. But I think they have been squeezed, almost sandwiched between, yes, both the state's ultranationalism and coercion from above, but also the pro-violence forces within the Kurdish movement, which also left the Kurdish liberals in a very difficult position. I'm against all kinds of violence, and I'm afraid that ultranationalisms keep breeding each other. Just to sum it up, I think it will be a catastrophe if they are arrested, because you are literally kicking out these legitimate voices that people have voted for on the basis that they're Kurdish or on the basis that they're critical-minded. Definitely, we don't want that to happen, and I'm very worried about that too, just like you.
So I would like to say something and then ask a question.
Sure.
I'm a Hungarian living in London, and I'm also a great fan of Agnes' work for the last 50 years. So when I heard that you are going to talk in Budapest, which will be videoed, I looked it up on Facebook, and to my despair, I found a lot of comments which are very blatantly racist, anti-Semitic, and very vulgar language. So it shocked me, and then I saw in the Hungarian website very openly fascist websites. So my statement is that I don't agree that it is just a moral question, that it doesn't need legal consequences to using hate speech, because hate speech has consequences as we saw it in Orlando. So my question is to Agnes and to Adam about, not related to what I just said. It's about what is your sense? What do you think? What will be the political consequences in Hungary and Poland of a Brexit? In other words, what is the likelihood that the Hungarian and Polish government will get the support of their people to leave the EU? I'm very concerned about that possibility, because I see the EU is providing some level of protection for the rights.
I think a hate speech can be prohibited, but one has to know exactly what can be considered a hate speech, a kind of hate, expression of hate, which can, at least can follow by violence. Now, if they say something against me in the internet, it cannot be followed by violence, because the internet, 3 people will answer this person in the opposite, that you know very well. But there are situations in which even the Hungarian government stepped and prohibited a demonstration when the so-called Goy motorbikists, these are really fascists, they are Nazis, they wanted to make a demonstration before the great synagogue of Budapest with the following slogan, more gas. Now that was more prohibited, because it's a very direct calling for violence. And that was no question. So I think it's important to know what is a hate speech. I can tell you another example. Someone made a critical remarks on the Catholic Church in Hungary, and certain MPs in the parliament said that this is a hate speech against the Catholic Church. It has to be prohibited. So what is a hate speech? If it is really hate speech, if it incites directly for violence or can directly incite for violence, this should be prohibited. But to say anything bad about others and even threaten others in a way which cannot have violent consequences, in this respect, I would not prohibit this kind of speech. I think we need to have a limit here. About Brexit, that's catastrophic for Eastern Europe, of course, because it would mean not necessarily that we leave the European Union, because you know all the investment of Hungary comes from the money of the European Union, but we can blackmail the European Union. After Brexit, whole Europe Eastern Europe will blackmail the Union. Now, they have allowed us this and that, because otherwise we would leave the Union. So I think it has very bad effect on Hungary, and I think also on Poland.
Yes.
I don't know about Poland, but I think that's a similar effect.
My compatriots have many vices, but they're very pro-European. And the opinion polls are like 80% or 85%. So union is being loved in Poland. The government, which would be rather among the Eurosceptics, but they know what the opinion polls are. So many things can happen, as you say. Maybe blackmail. I don't know. But many people say it would lead to this hardcore Europe, the Euro Europe, and the rest, the second rank Europe, the non-Euro Europe, which will have not much to say. I think that's the probable scenario, that Europe will exist, but as a kind of heap of countries, not as a organism. So. But no, we want Europe, and I do too.
Of course. Please, yes, please.
Also Hungarian, living in London. And in a way, it's an extension of the last question. In fact, if I may put 2 questions together, why do you think illiberal democracy arises at this point in so many places, in such different places? Yeah. And secondly, what is the role of the European Union in trying to bring some order to this very fissile sense of nationalism?
Europe has no long tradition of liberal democracy. Even Western Europe has not a long tradition of liberal. I mean continental Europe. I don't mean England, don't mean continental Europe has a very short history of liberal democracy. Southern Europe basically even shorter than Portugal, in Spain, in Greece. There was military dictatorship and fascism for a long time, even after the Second World War. That liberal democracy is new. And Europe has always turned to dictators when when some problems occurred, when in a state of crisis. Continental Europeans have the habit to with a dictator or support a dictator, support the kind of Napoleon or Mussolini or something like this, or Horthy or something like this. Europeans have no frustration tolerance, haven't developed frustration tolerance. And frustration tolerance means that there can be bad times, there can be a crisis, not the migrant crisis. We will get through this crisis, but if there is a crisis, if you don't get richer and richer each and every day, then they will lose faith in liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is often understood as a means to get a better life. And it does not, in a way, provide the goods. Yeah? Does not do the goods, then it's not good enough. Then we need someone who decides instead of us and will decide better, like in Singapore, you mentioned this case, and we'll be richer, and we do not need to take care of what happens to us. And East Europe, in this respect, worse, because we have less traditional liberal democracy, at least the Western Europe. And Southern Europe had some decades already, after the 20th century. But we never face the past. We can face perhaps the Nazi past, but not Hungary. But Germany did it. But we do not face the whole past of the 20th century. In 20th century, we have to know it, that Europeans murdered 100 million Europeans, not to speak about non-Europeans. 100 million Europeans were murdered by Europeans, continental Europeans, I mean. Yeah, I speak about them. And we do that. They never face the past. They they speak about European values, as these European values would be eternal values. And another matter, I'm sorry to speak it too long, but it belongs to the question. That is, Europe developed two rights in the same time, 18th century, human rights and citizen rights. And the two can enter into conflict with one another. And now in Europe, and even in Western Europe, we experience the situation when the human rights and citizen rights collide with each other.
No, it's also so similar to what we experience in Turkey with our collective amnesia, failure to face the past. Absolutely. Please. Yeah.
Is there any evidence in Poland that the tens of thousands of people who've been regularly demonstrating for the past 7 months are effectively restraining the government in any way by expressing their democratic right and demonstrating? Is it causing the government to stop and think and perhaps not move as quickly as it might with its changes?
Well, it's very hard to measure. There's certainly some nervousness in the government. Whether they slowed down their course, their policy, I don't know, maybe a little bit. There is some impact, certainly. It's not something it's invisible, and it's very much visible in the public sphere, and you see that the government doesn't know what to do with it. But in the long term, it will be hard. It's hard to say, but I'm pretty sure it will continue, and it will not die down. So I think it's an important factor.
You mentioned earlier that how politics in the kitchen, in the bedroom, in all parts of our life, in Turkey particularly. But don't you think it's not only about politics, it's also about the role of religion, how the government is using religion as a tool to direct people and to impact them, how they should think about life, about bedroom or all part of our life. That's one thing I wanted to ask you, what is the role of religion and how government uses it as a tool? Mm-hmm. And secondly, I wanted to ask, because you raised a point about how, from Turkey, how you think that you should express, or how limited you are in terms of how you would like to express yourself, whether other panelists are sharing that common problem. And I just wanted to ask, how free do you feel, even when you're in England? Can you express yourself in the way you want?
Thank you. Tough questions. The truth is. But I think I do make a distinction between fiction and non-fiction. So I would be lying to you if I say when I write, because I write for various newspapers from time to time, and most of them are political pieces. So when I write a non-fiction op-ed piece, I would be lying to you if I say I'm 100% free, I don't think carefully. I do think. I write critical pieces. But yes, I do think about every word, and I know many of them are translated immediately into Turkish, and then you start getting all kinds of nasty things. But when I write fiction, it's a different world, because when you're writing a novel, you live inside that novel for weeks, for months, sometimes for years, and that becomes your reality. You know, you forget about the so-called real world. That's why I'm always, I don't know what the word is, wiser or somehow less anxious or maybe more courageous. If it's courage, I don't know what other word I might use, but somehow more relaxed and bolder when I'm writing fiction. When the book is over, when the novel is over, and I give it to my editor, then I start to worry. But it's too late, the book is out, it has a life of its own. And what I meant is, in Turkey, obviously there are issues that are very difficult to write about. Nationalism is one of them. The past, confronting the atrocities of the past, is another one. I had a taste of this when I was put on trial for writing about the Armenian genocide, for using the word genocide. But I'm also aware that when you write about incest, rape, domestic violence, again you get a lot of reaction. So those areas are also becoming very difficult to touch, to tackle. It's a whole ideology. It's an ideological shift, maybe more than a political shift. It's much more widespread. And yes, religion is an important part of this. I think we are becoming more and more, not only conservative, but more and more religious. And we were not able to bring out more embracing maybe interpretations of Islam, like the one I find, for instance, in Islamic mysticism, which to me is very close to Jewish mysticism, which is very close to Christian mysticism. We were not able to bring out those voices, more peaceful voices, more all-embracing voices like Sinan, the architect Sinan, who would talk about how we all lived under the same dome, all of us, Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, Muslims, equal space. Instead of doing that, we went in the opposite direction in Turkey. And it is a particular interpretation of Islam that has become the hegemony, the main narrative. Just to give you an example, to me it's very important. My kids go to school here in London, and they learn about all religions, and I love that. And they're celebrating each other's festivities, and they have friends from all backgrounds. In Turkey, children learn only about Islam, about nothing else, and only one interpretation of Islam. And it's becoming more and more widespread through Quran schools. So what they are doing is narrowing down all the interpretations. And I find that very dangerous and very oppressive. So religion is definitely part of the picture.
Does freedom mean different things in different parts of Europe? Is it a purely relative concept, or should it be seen objectively?
That's a very good question. I think it depends on the tradition, also on the tradition. What people understand when we speak about freedom. But when you speak about liberties, that's a different issue, because you know what liberties are. They are political categories. We need a different kind of liberties. This is basically political liberalism, that all liberties have to be granted. Freedom is a complicated matter, because freedom itself has so many different interpretations. I would like to live in a world in which all interpretations of freedom can be simultaneously realized, but this is not the case. I just refer to a conflict between citizen rights and human rights. Here is the migrant crisis. in Europe. Margaret, when you think all men are born equally free, they are equally endowed by the Creator with reason and conscience. Now, if that's a human rights issue, we say, let them in. What is the difference between us and them? We are all human beings. And then comes the citizens. The citizens has the right to decide who should live among them. Citizens said they should not live among. Now, two freedoms. Two freedoms. Both are interpretations of freedom. Human right is an interpretation, citizen right interpretation. They can collide with each other. And I meant only, that's only one example because it's actual. There are many examples. So I would like all interpretation of freedom should be actualized at the same time. It is utopian. Of course it is utopian. But when I speak about liberty, liberty should be the identical idea about liberties. And if you speak about illiberal democracy, you mean that certain kind of liberties will be restricted. That you don't speak about freedom. You speak about certain kind of liberties will be restricted. Not everyone can have equal voice in matters of politics, but the center has the voice in matters of politics. And you can express your opinion at home, but your newspapers in which you can express your view will be prohibited and will not get money and will be marginalized. Yeah, this is on the matters of liberty, not the matters of freedom. In matters of liberty also, what you mentioned, what you speak political correctness. And political correctness was basically a very dogmatic aspect, but to deny it, you said, it's even worse than to accept it. My son said, it's bad political correctness, but because due to political correctness, certain things will never occur in a person's mind in the next generation. There will be no homophobes in the generation. There will be no anti-Semites because they cannot hear it anymore because the speech is not forbidden by law, but by society. That's very important. Because when we speak about political correctness, it is not a legal issue. There are no laws against this or for it.
In the US, there are. At the universities.
Yeah, that's a private institution. But not in the public sphere, there is no prohibition. The private institutions, they discriminate, or they make a discrimination against discrimination, you may know that, yeah? But this was important, because without this, women would never get into the place of decision-making process. As for example, in America, they are in the decision-making process, women, because of political correctness. Because political correctness. Yeah. But whereas in Hungarian parliament, 4% of the members of our parliament are women, 4%.
Well, I am Ukrainian, probably only one here, so for me Europe is in war already for 2 years, although I feel that many Europeans still don't feel like this, but Europe is in war already. But going to illiberal democracy, it seems the role model for all three regimes is Vladimir Putin. Also, only Viktor Orban openly admires him, and Polish and Turkish presidents don't say it openly, but probably in their mind he is a role model, and he calls his democracy managed democracy, which sounds much, much nicer, better, more acceptable, but it's basically the same as illiberal democracy. I just wonder why Viktor Orban came with these new words when there is already managed democracy in Russia for 16 years. So what do you think about Putin and him being a model for all these three regimes and for all others in waiting who are looking at him and admiring him as a strong man of Europe or the world, the man to admire?
I agree with you, and I don't know historically who, well, we know who Putin admires, right? There was Mr. Stalin before Putin. So there's a chain of role models here, a not very pleasant chain. But your remark is absolutely true. And I think even people like I suspect that maybe some Polish politicians who on the surface are very anti-Putin, but maybe at night they admire.
I run a small publishing press here, and I would love to publish people who are finding it difficult. Are there any other ways in which people living in London can help their friends? Any other ways in which people living in London or the rest of the UK can help their friends in other countries? What would you recommend, each of you?
Well, the editor-in-chief of Cumhuriyet newspaper, he recently gave a very strong interview to German media, and he said, I just want to remind our friends, maybe I'm not quoting him directly, but that's how I remember it. I just want to remind people that Turkey is not solely composed of Erdogan or his followers. We're also here. This is also our motherland. This is also our country, and we exist. There are many Democrats in Turkey, some of them journalists, academics. Some of those academics have been arrested. They lost their jobs just because they signed a petition, a peace petition. I think it's very important that we keep reading about what's happening in other countries. What you're saying is very important, you know, making their voices heard all over the world and translating their works. I think it's tremendously important, because the other is a very dark tunnel when people think they're all alone and nobody cares about their struggle. I think that's a very dark tunnel.
Yes, I would add to this that during the time of Kada regime or communist regime in Eastern Europe, people from England, from you, gave a lot of support to the opposition. And of course, this is not a totalitarian government, this is an illiberal democracy, but I think we need also your support. Support in all means, especially intellectual support. So this is what I wanted to...
If may I add, you inspired me to just add one thing. At the end of this month, there's going to be a gay pride parade in Istanbul. This has been going on for several years. Last year, it was stopped with water cannon, you know, tear gas partially. This year, it's going to go ahead. But now we are reading these threats from both Islamist websites and also ultra-nationalists. Both of them are saying we're going to stop it, and we're going to do everything in our means to stop these people. I think it's important to be aware of what's going on in Istanbul, to support the parade in social media, creating awareness. People, I think, would like to hear that too. Yeah.
Because there are people who you can support. Because that I come back to what you said, there are several oppositioners in this country. Several people really risk a lot. In Turkey, perhaps more than in Poland, in Hungary, but still, even in Holland and Hungary, they do put something very important to risk. So we would need your support.
Sure. You were saying,
Well, one thing is, in my heroic times, in the late 70s, when I joined this opposition, I remember how we praised and how we needed the magazine Index on Censorship. It remains in my memory as this wonderful magazine. Later, I must say, I stopped reading, and maybe too early. But now your question, you know, I don't think after 7 months we still don't need it. We have 400 young poets who are looking for a publisher, but if they have difficulties, not political difficulties, there are too many. So, but
have several anthologies.
Several
so yes,
for each country.
100 anthologies.
Well, thank you so much. May I thank our wonderful panelists and you for your questions. I think it was a wonderful discussion.
The evening is not yet quite finished. Adam, you mentioned young poets, and at Free Word we have a tradition where we commission young poets up and down the country to work with us, to respond to write about some of the issues that we are discussing at Free Word. And this evening it gives me great pleasure to introduce Alix Alixandra, who is a songwriter, a singer, and a performance poet who has written about the subject that we've been discussing this evening. Alix.
Hi, I'm really very honoured to be here. It's been an incredible evening. Thank you for this opportunity. My paper's going to fall over. I'm very nervous. When I'm nervous, I chat too much and I become a little too honest. I'm sitting on a hard chair, my bottom's gone to sleep. This is a poem. It's just a collection of incredibly short stories about the concepts of freedom and democracy, but from the perspective of a 25-year-old socialist living in Britain with our political malarkeys. And how I'm aware that in this life that I've lived for 25 years, really, a little overly dramatic, but I am a poet. Really, every breath I've ever taken, I've taken for granted. You see, because I remember when a local gang let their dogs off their leads, how I ran home, my screams caught in my throat. I remember how my mothers, they locked the doors and they drew the blinds and we sat there together in the quiet. I was taught young to take pride in where I come from. My garden wall was the first defense I ever knew, expanding out to the outlines of my country, all of those pretty colors of my map. So when they closed those borders, I should know which bits are mine and which bits foreign. Foreign, a word for other, the word that I have always been taught to fear, here where democracy seems to equate to ignorance is bliss, as if we don't realize that the bombs make refugees of all of us. Democracy? Ooh, I hear my grandfather say. How can there be democracy when their masks are all the same? Democracy to him, it looked like a polling booth, hollow and temporary. My grandmother, she would wink at me. Freedom was her having the right to disagree and choosing not to say anything. Freedom was her voting slip coming through the post alongside his. Freedom was her putting an X in a different box, and she wonders where she'll vote when her mark doesn't change anything and all the libraries close. In Manchester, I marched against my government. On the coaches home, we patted ourselves on the back. Good job, well done. They were meeting, you see. It was a party conference. They put a wall of steel around their building, and I marched all day around that perimeter in a crowd 10,000 strong. And to show us how they hated us, they put snipers on the roofs of the conference center, just to say, we let you march. Remember, you are here because we let you be. And the next day, we were just a couple of hundred egg-throwing, boot-stomping thugs on the news, reduced and dismissed. The savage left. Are you buying this? While our Prime Minister sits in his high chair and sneers at the leader of the opposition for wearing a cheap suit, as if suits are politics, as if suits write government policy, as if suits can stop wars or build homes or deliver those displaced children safely into their parents' arms, because every breath I take for granted. And I remember running home, and I remember the dogs, and I remember locking my door, and I remember sitting quietly with my mums, and I remember the feeling of safety, and I remember thinking they can't get through the door. Now, I'm not scared of dogs on leads. The men in these gangs, they wear expensive suits, and the police, they know their names. Their faces are all over the news. What do we do? What do we do when the ones who threaten us hold the keys to all of our doors? What do we do when they come for us? How do we keep them out?